Welcome back to Marine Biology at Home. This is our third lecture. Who am I? My name is Seabird McKeon. I am a doctor of zoology and biodiversity with strong interests in the marine life of this planet. I can be found at thenaturalistpodcast.com or on Twitter at Seabird McKeon and a variety of different other places. In our last lecture, I talked about how the chemical and physical properties of water are important for life on Earth. In this lecture, I want to try to use basic oceanography to take us from the abiotic factors that influence the marine environments into the subject that really brings us all here, which is marine biology. Oceanography is a huge topic in its own right, and to do it justice will take more information than I can provide you in a short lecture. We'll get back to this topic for currents and tides and waves later on in the course, but just know we could do an entire course just on oceanography. Alright, here's a map. It's a basic map of our planet, all flattened out for us. And you can see there are four major ocean basins. So there's the Pacific, there's the Atlantic, the Indian, and the Arctic, right? At the same time, there are smaller bodies of water. We call these the marginal seas. And the marginal seas are numerous, so it's not just 7 of them. So we've got the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, the Baltic, the Bering, South China, Coral, Okhotsk, all sorts of different seas. But it's important to remember that all of these bodies of water are connected. And they're connected enough that our planet appears mostly blue from space. And our pale blue dot in space has a few abiotic influences. We'll start with gravity and movement. The formation of the Earth had a lot to do with gravity and movement, and these are the forces that still have tremendous influence on how Earth works. So there's the rotation of the Earth around its axis, the rotation of the Earth around the Sun, the rotation of the Moon around the Earth. So movement and gravity are still playing a large role in how our planet works. But the one that I think is most important for us to discuss right now is light. So the big one is light from the sun. So solar radiation from the sun heats the Earth and creates the winds and drives ocean circulation. But it doesn't do this evenly. So just because of the tilt, the amount of light that hits the Earth coming from the sun varies depending on where you are on the Earth. Right around the equator, the sun rays strike the Earth almost perpendicularly, right? Straight on. Whereas if you're up towards the pole, the rays of the sun are spread out over a larger area and take a longer path through the atmosphere. And this differential heating of the Earth's surface is why we have temperature differences on our planet. If the planet was completely water, we would expect to have some fairly even patterns. Some seasonal variation, but it would be a smooth progression as we go from the equator towards the north and south poles. This is made more complex by the presence of the continents. So the continents disrupting the flow of air and water masses over the surface of the planet really shakes things up a bit, changes the way that we expect this differential heating to impact the Earth. So when we're talking about abiotic factors, I really want to be focused on light, the movement of air and water masses, how those things are interacting with the shapes of the ocean basins and coastlines. And when it comes to light in particular, we're thinking about temperature. How is solar energy transferred into temperature of water? And depth. Do we lose light as we get deeper? And those coastlines, well, how does it all interact there? So here's a satellite image of the surface of the ocean. And the hotter colors, so reds and oranges, are higher temperatures. The cooler colors, greens and blues, are cooler. I want you to think about the fact that most marine organisms are poikilothermic, or cold-blooded, you could say. And since seawater temperatures vary latitudinally, the distribution of marine organisms is a reflection of the geographical differences in ocean temperatures. And based on surface ocean temperature and the distribution of organisms, we can start to describe 4 major geographic zones. So starting from the north and working our way towards the equator, our major geographical zones in oceans, or at least the surface of the ocean, are the polar regions, found at both the north and south poles of our planet. Then we get into what's called the cold temperate, right next to the subtropical waters. And this is where most of us have our experiences with the ocean. Tropical oceans are uniformly warm, and then the pattern repeats on our way south. So this pattern of 4 zones applies to the surface waters of the ocean, but it doesn't really apply to depth. So we need to talk about how ocean temperature varies with depth. Surface waters in the tropics are warm year-round at about 20 to 30 degrees C. And in the temperate regions of the ocean, surface waters are also warm during the summer. But in both of these places, we see a dramatic decrease in the temperature with depth. And this is called a thermocline. So looking at this graph that I've got beside us, you can see on the x-axis across the top, we have increasing temperature from 0 to 24 degrees. On the y-axis along the side, we have increasing depth in meters. And the thermocline is represented here by this red line, and in particular, one zone of this red line. So a thermocline is the depth zone where the temperature changes the most. And here, it's at about 100 to 200 meters, we have rapid change in the temperature of the water. But you can imagine that this is going to vary depending on where you are on the planet. So the thermocline is persistent in the tropics. It's present in the temperate regions during the summer when the surface waters are warm, and then it is almost entirely absent in the polar regions. So let's see if we can mock that out. Okay, in this similar graph, again with temperature across the x-axis and depth on the y-axis, we can see that there's little change in the temperature of polar waters from the surface to depth, right? From 0 to 3,000 meters. The tropics, on the other hand, have this distinct change, this distinct thermocline, going from almost 25 or 26 degrees C down to about 5 degrees C at 3,000 meters. Now, temperate zone in the left-hand side of this graph is averaged out. So we just have this kind of intermediary line. But if we look at the right side of this graph, we can see what's really going on. And that's that we have seasonal differences. We have high temperature surface waters during the summer, and then we have much cooler temperatures for the winter seasons. So we have a switching back and forth between a strong thermocline or a weak thermocline. And we call the switch between those two seasonal patterns in the thermocline overturn, or when the thermocline breaks down. So I've just described to you what happens with temperature going from surface waters to depth. And that's depicted in this graph in the center. But we also have some changes for some other abiotic factors. Things like salinity that we talked about in the last lecture. And you might remember that I said that there are things or factors that both increase salinity, things like evaporation, or decrease salinity, or like an inflowing river. So we have variation at the surface waters, but again, it all kind of reaches a stable point at depth. Density as well has some variation, and remember that density of water is tied to temperature. So here we've almost got the reverse pattern from what we've got going on with temperature itself. So remember that the density of water is going to increase to 4 degrees C. And where do things balance out? And why? It's because it's just before we get into ice and that rapid change in the density of water. So on the basis of these abiotic factors, we can say that we know of 2 different water masses in the planet. And we could divide those water masses into the upper water mass, or the surface waters, where we've got well-mixed waters from interaction with the atmosphere. It's in motion due to the winds. And then we have this very stable, deep water mass that's beneath the Thermocline, where everything's kind of averaged out, and it's all very much the same. So we're going to take some time to figure out how do we actually describe marine environments, because we're going to need this to be able to talk about the life that lives in these regions. So I'm going to be speaking about the substrate or substratum, right? So what is actually down there on the bottom? Is it rocky? Is it muddy? Where is it located? I'm going to be talking about the distance from shoreline. So how far away is it from land? And we're going to talk about these depth factors. So light and pressure and temperature. And we've got to somehow map these all out together to give us a picture as to how can we divide marine environments. This illustration shows you just how complex it can seem. So we've got all sorts of labels over all sorts of regions on all sorts of different axes. So we're going to break this down and break it apart and go on a little bit of a tour. We're going to use 2 main regions to divide the waters so that we can go on our tour. So we're going to be talking about the Pelagic regions, which are open water, and then we're going to be talking about benthic regions, which is the bottom of the sea. All right, here we go. So the first breakdown of pelagic waters, so you can see right across the top of this graphic, is labeled as pelagic waters. We've got Neritic Zone and an Oceanic Zone. So the Neritic Zone encompasses water masses overlying continental shelves, whereas the Oceanic Zone encompasses everything else as far as open waters. So what's special about this Neritic Zone that's on the continental shelf? Well, this is a minority of the world's ocean. We're only talking about 8% of the ocean area, and just by definition of being over those continental shelves, this water is mostly shallow. We're ranging in depth from about 0 to 200 meters. But it has a disproportionately large number of species. So many species in these areas. And this region of the ocean is characterized by interaction of the land and the sea. So we have lots of wave action, we get nutrients from runoff on land, and a lot of the major fisheries of the world are found in the Neritic zones. Part of the Neritic zone is called the littoral, and this is 0 to 100 meters from low tide to the limits of wave action. And this is really the transitional zone between oceans and land, and this is an area of extreme abiotic variation. So being able to deal with change, air exposure, all of that new water, fresh water flowing in, the changes in temperatures that we were talking about with seasons. So the littoral zone and the Neritic zone are exposed to a lot more of that than other parts of the open ocean. The pelagic zone, by comparison, or the truly open waters, don't have as much of that terrigenous or land influence on them. And here we can define our pelagic zone in a few different ways just by itself. So we're offshore now. So how do we break down the big blue? Well, first step is probably photic and aphotic. So photic meaning light and aphotic. So progressing vertically, not horizontally anymore, the pelagic can be divided between the photic zone, which has light, and the aphotic zone with no light. And generally speaking, it's about 200 meters down, where the light starts to attenuate and we start to miss out on things like photosynthesis that are critical to biology. This is important. This distinction between having light and not having light is critical. Why? Well, if you think about it, the photic zone is providing all of the energy for phytoplankton. So 40% of the Earth's photosynthesis is coming from phytoplankton, or small floating algae and other plants or other photosynthetic organisms that are up there. Once you get beneath that photic zone, you are out of the region of photosynthesis. Most of the life in the photic zone can be divided between plankton and nekton. Plankton is the term that we use to describe things that can adjust depth, but they don't swim actively. And primarily here we're talking about phytoplankton, whereas nekton can swim. So lots of zooplankton can swim, mollusks, some mollusks can swim, crustaceans, vertebrates of different types. And so it's interesting for me because the life of the photic zone of pelagic areas of the ocean includes both tiny unicellular animals and the largest things on the planet. So whale sharks are the largest fish on the planet, feed mostly on plankton. Blue whales, the largest mammal on the planet now, and potentially the largest organism that we know to have existed on the planet, also feeds on zooplankton, largely in the photic zone of the pelagic region. Okay, we've got more zones, so we've got more breaking down of the pelagic, and this was perhaps best highlighted by Mr. Ray in Finding Nemo, who starts to name them off for you, so if you can remember his song, you're on your way. But progressing vertically, the pelagic can be divided. So the epipelagic is the pelagic part of the photic zone, right? That surface area, whereas the Mesopelagic is the uppermost part of the aphotic zone. It's kind of the transitional area. It's a bit of a twilight zone. Then there's Bathypelagic, so getting quite deep. We're talking from 1,000 meters to 2,000 meters. The Abyssal Pelagic, and the Abyssal Pelagic is overlying the plains of the open ocean. So on the bottom, we've come off of the slopes in the Basal Zone and the Bathypelagic, and now we're above the abyssal plains. And then really, really deep, so 6,000 to 10,000 meters down, we're talking about the Hadal-Pelagic, which is the open water of the deep ocean trenches. So you might remember I had talked to you about how most of the world is cold and dark and deep. Well, here it is. Bathypelagic, Abyssal Pelagic, Hadal-Pelagic. Corresponding with these pelagic zones, there are 3 benthic zones. So the Basal Zone, which is the ocean bottom on the continental slope and rise. The Abyssal Zone, which, like I mentioned, is the ocean bottom associated with the abyssal plains. And the Hadal Zone, or the ocean bottom associated with trenches. Moving up, we can start to talk about the sublittoral or shelf zone. So on the continental shelf, these are the benthic regions, or the ocean bottom regions, that we typically think of when we're thinking about marine environments. So coral reefs, kelp beds, all that sort of thing are found mostly in the sublittoral or the shelf zones of the ocean. And then we're into the transition zones. So we're back up where the land meets the sea, and we're in the intertidal or littoral zone, the area between high tide and low tide. And just like when we started with the water part of the littoral, the benthic part of the littoral is also an area of extremes. So this is where organisms need to be able to deal with being exposed to the air for a tidal cycle or rapid swings in temperature. What is neat about these areas that are right up next to the shore is that they are tremendously productive. So the nearshore waters are where most of the productivity and the biodiversity are located in marine environments. And you can see, looking at this map, that they occur mostly in temperate regions. Why? Why do you think that is? We'll get to it in a future lecture, but for now, we want to start our tour through the types of nearshore environments and the groups of organisms found in marine systems. So what is next up? Next up is plankton. I'm excited about this one. Where can you ask questions? Well, we have a Facebook group called Marine Biology at Home that is set up for you to ask questions. So please take advantage of it. We have lots of expert folks standing by, some of which are great people like Shamar Blakeney. And you can find Shamar at Blakeney_truth or Shamar_Blakeney on Instagram. Dr. C, the famous Dr. C, amazing ocean educator. And Amy Turner, a writer who's helping us with editing. So we've got lots of great people working behind and in support of the lecture series that hopefully you will see more of coming up. If you would like to help, please get in touch. If you would like to donate a lecture, if you are a marine scientist or a marine educator, or if you'd like to assist with online learning as a student or someone who's still actively studying, we would love it. So please reach out. We will see you soon.